So now that we've got our high poly meshes all created in ZBrush, let's start turning them into low poly meshes where they can actually be useful in a game engine. I've simply decimated my entire character in ZBrush and brought it all over to Maya, where I like to do my retopologizing and UVing. In Maya, I'll make sure to combine any high poly meshes that I want to be one single solid mesh in its final low poly state. For instance, while the sweater and the body are separate meshes in high poly, I want them to instead merge into one single mesh in the low poly state so they can more easily be animated and deformed with less clipping and other issues. Then I'll make the high poly mesh that I want to work on live in Maya, meaning it'll act as a kind of magnetic form for me to build the low poly on top of. And then I'll use Quadra to start drawing quads like this. See how the vertices I'm putting down are just sticking to the live high poly mesh underneath? I can keep drawing out verts and then creating quads or tris or anything out of them. Then I'll just sit here and quietly draw thousands of squares for about half a week to a week or so. This is definitely the most tedious part of creating a character, at least for me who doesn't super enjoy it, but it is quite meditative and relaxing if you can get into it while listening to a podcast or something. But we can't zone out too much since making all these quads serves an important purpose and we have to make sure we're creating them in a useful way. So our three main goals here are to make sure we're putting our edge loops in important places to support the model deforming in natural ways during animation, putting vertices in important places to support form definition in the model itself, and making sure to keep the poly count as low as we can while maintaining the last things I just said. It's a lot of balancing and thinking about a lot of different things at first, but it gets easier and easier the more you do it, and eventually it'll feel more like a chill puzzle game, kind of. Topology-wise, I always look at cinematic animation models for guidance on edge loops and to learn more about them as well. They're a lot more complex than game models with a lot denser meshes, but the principle behind the edge loops is the same. Games are just requiring more optimized models for real time, so we've just got a bit less bandwidth to work with. So here I'm being extra careful to make sure that there are plenty of edge loops that go all the way around this armpit area, just so that the arms can be raised and dropped with proper deformations. This is the main reason that we sculpt our characters in an A pose with the arms slightly raised. If they were to have their hands at their sides in a more natural, relaxed pose, it'd be really difficult to get some topology going under the armpit area that will help the deformations look more natural, like when the arms are raised up and stuff. Now the arms are kind of in a middle position, so it'll be easy to both bring the arms down a bit for a more relaxed posture, but also to raise them up for all kinds of different movements and poses. If a character needs their arms to be raised over their heads a lot and held in pretty extreme maneuvers, I might even sculpt them in more of a T pose with their arms higher up, just so they're kind of in an in-between state for a lot of the motions that the character will need to perform. But judging from the basic idea of our character's mobility, and especially with our character's giant puff sleeves, I doubt she'll be needing too much flexibility. So we're just going for more of an A pose. It's important to keep thinking about what the function of the areas we're retopologizing actually serves, and to make sure we're enabling those functions with our edge loop and polygon placement choices. I like to start working in the areas that I know need the most complex and most specific edge loops and kind of work on the filler areas around them afterwards. So at the very beginning, I started with the face, then I quickly spread out over to the armpit/shoulder areas, and now I'm working on the hip/pelvis area and spreading down to the knees and feet, and just making sure the areas that more bends and deformations will be happening in have denser topology to help enable that. After this, I'll move on to working on the hands that are going to be pretty dense and complex, and then start connecting the more filler areas in between. There are some areas that shouldn't really deform at all. For instance, the middle of the shins, the thighs, forearms, stuff like that. In those areas, we can focus more on making sure the topology is supporting the visuals more and worry less about its functionality. So as an example, with these boots on the feet, we really need to make sure the ankles and toes can bend and maneuver with proper edge loops. But for the filler areas like on the shins, we can just focus on making sure these kind of leather straps and borders that go over the boot look nice and clean from all kinds of angles and just represent the form really well. We don't want to get too nutty with the topology though. It's still best practice to keep some clean loops and have them move in a logical way. So looking at these hands here, and hands are usually one of the more complex areas topology-wise on character models, along with faces. Just because there are so many joints and deformations happening in the hands, and you need to have the edge loops to account for all of them. On these normal human hands, I usually just give the knuckles a bit of definition so they don't collapse when they're bent over and retain a bit of volume. And then I just make sure there's enough edge loops around each joint to hold the form together even when those areas are bent as far as like 90 degrees or more. This is usually as far as I'll go for small hands like these in a game where they won't be shown very much. But if you were working on, let's say, a first-person shooter, for instance, the hands will probably need to be much higher fidelity for them to look nice and animate well so close up to the camera. For these hair chunks in the back, I'm imagining them not like being able to fly and bend around everywhere like tentacles or something, but instead they'd be more like bouncy and springy with a limited range. So instead of adding a bunch of edge loops around and around, I'll just put enough that they can be moved and rotated around just slightly. I found that a lot of retopo in games isn't really just filling up the mesh or following a formula for loops, but it's more about understanding how the final character model should be able to animate or what kinds of things they're going to need to be able to do. Without having any idea how a bunch of these pieces would need to move or work, it's really hard to decide how to build things. For instance, if our tea brewer needed to work in some kind of, I don't know, extreme gymnastics kind of game scenario or something like that, we'd need a lot more body edge loops for way more mobility, flexibility, and stretchiness throughout. So context is kind of everything when it comes to 3D characters. Everyone kind of has their own style of doing retopology as well, and I won't say mine is the best way or someone else's is. Maybe it's taken more seriously by some 3D artists, but I kind of just see it as something like when it works, and that's all I really care about. It might be because I find this step really tedious and not super interesting, but that's not to say I'm not trying to get better at it or anything, but I might be taking less proactive steps to learn. When I started learning 3D halfway into university, we were taught this more old school way of making characters where we box modeled the entire character first in Maya, and then we sculpted on top of that in ZBrush. And that pipeline almost killed 3D for me because we were basically all newbies starting out, and learning topology and box modeling first for me personally was like, damn, I kind of hate it here actually. Maybe because my background was basically all 2D traditional art and I really just wanted to, work more creatively. It wasn't until after like a year of struggling that I found this pipeline that I'm currently using where you start with the fun sculpting bit and then the tedious retopo and UV bit afterwards, and then back to fun texturing. Um, there are pros and cons to both pipelines, but this one supports the way I like to work more, and I feel like it's more flexible and open for those sudden urges to do 180s and change things, and also to have those creative, happy little accidents while sculpting. Some pipelines, though, that I've worked in have been a bit more rigid, and sometimes they'll want artists to do steps in very specific orders in very specific ways, and that's so that the work can be just passed between different artists more flexibly at any point in the pipeline. So there have been cases where I needed to box model early on, uh, just for specific pipelines. So I still think it's a skill set that's worthwhile to know, even if you're not really box modeling in Maya. If you know how to use like ZModeler and ZBrush, that's usually fine too. But yeah, just like understanding how to like build and manipulate these like more low poly assets is still important in certain scenarios. Both sides take significantly different skills and approaches, and I don't think one is necessarily harder or easier than the other. If you find yourself being a 3D artist that likes to do a bit of both, though, there are many smaller game studios that are really happy to have 3D artists do more concepting and just a lot more overall creating assets from start to finish. And even a few larger studios on specific games. Usually, the less people there are on a team, the more likely it is that people working there are expected to wear more hats, meaning like the more roles you can fill and the more you can contribute across different disciplines, the better. If you're an artist that even likes rigging and animation along with 3D and want to be more of a generalist, there are definitely many jobs out there for that as well. On the flip side, some studios I've worked at that were pretty large had disciplines that ran super deep instead of more broadly, if that makes sense. And their roles became super specialized, where maybe you would only be in charge of doing, say, textures on characters, stuff like that. Even outside of the industry itself, there are lots of 3D artists that take the more traditional art approach and become more uh, like solo working fine artists. They have a unique style and I guess brand that they call their own, and they make a living off of their own personal work. Then there's people like me that just enjoy being mostly an engineer by day at work and doing more of my own thing and creating personal work as a hobby. I enjoy doing a bit of both, but they serve different purposes in my life, and uh, I really need them both to keep myself balanced out. But, anyways, the point is that there's kind of something for everyone, at least from what I've seen and experienced, and it's way more important that you figure out just what it is that you like to do first. Alright, so now we're on to retopology for our sweet baby teapot companion. He's basically all symmetrical, so it won't take very long. The one thing I'm watching out for right now is that I want to try adding some simple kind of foggy glass shader to this big belly part so we can see some of the plants and herbs hiding in there. But then I've got to be careful how I'm making the meshes that surround the glass, so when you look through it, you won't be able to see just like a bunch of messed up mesh back faces and stuff like that, or issues from where the structures intersect. So I'm gonna just leave it like this for now and test the shader on the high poly glass mesh first before deciding what to do. So here's our boy for now. So now that we've got everything laid out in low poly, we need to create some UVs before we can continue on to baking and painting textures. To start, I've basically just deleted one half of all the pieces that are symmetrical because we're busy people and we don't have time to do things twice. So some of these areas will have overlapping UVs on the final UV set since that will save us a lot of texture space, but others I'll just lay them out separately afterwards if I don't want them overlapping. These are usually meant for bigger areas where you'll see both sides of the model, and the overlapping UVs will just look too obvious if both sides are perfectly symmetrical. Of course, this really depends on the fidelity of your game, if you have the texture bandwidth to actually texture things asymmetrically. For instance, if your game can only support like 1024 by 1024 textures per character, then maybe it's not great to use that precious texture space just to add a little bit of visual interest. Sometimes though, I'll unwrap a symmetrical model like asymmetrically so I can make some interesting differences happen on both sides of the model, but then I run out of time or forget or something and that's like super cringe. But for the most part, I think it's still nice to do in bigger areas where you can see both sides of the model pretty regularly, if you can spare it. So the UV laying out has actually already started, but to walk you through basically how I start, which isn't anything special, I usually just select my entire character model, all the meshes, and just hit automatic UVs under the UV tab. Then I sew all those broken up UVs together and hit unfold on all of them. They're still going to be ugly, but that's where I'll go in piece by piece and start cutting seams and laying them out. I use the UV distortion button a lot in the UV editor just to check that the UVs are being laid out in a way where none of them are too stretched or too squashed. You can see from the red areas, that means that they don't have enough space, and the blue is like too much space. Once that's done for all the pieces, I'll grab all of them, scale them to the same texel density, then just hit the auto layout button in the UV toolkit. This does a pretty good job, but it's not like the best, so you know what we gotta do. Well, we're not gonna redo it entirely, but I like to just reassemble some things. For instance, a lot of these UVs are like back faces or areas you might not see very often, so I like to just scale those down so they take up a bit less texture space. Also, I like to scale up the whole face area in general so we can get those extra juicy painted details into there later. Anything that will show a lot on camera and we want to add a lot of nice details to, I'll usually just scale up a tiny bit more. And here I'll also mirror those meshes again that I deleted earlier to make them whole. And if there's any UVs I want to lay out instead of overlap, I'll do that here too and just make sure everything has space. And now for our boy again. Even though he's basically all symmetrical, there's a couple areas I want to keep asymmetrical, like the glass and the kettle schnozzle, the spout. I don't know, since we'll see that pretty often in close up, I don't want them to look so obviously symmetrical. Alright, so now that both our tea brewer and her kettle have their UVs, we can start the arduous task of texture baking, where we'll pretty much be doing a lot of trial and error and we'll inevitably have to go back anyways to reshuffle UVs or push some vertices around. But yeah, let's go.